Welcome to the KeyNote Women Expert Voices podcast. My name is Tien, and together with me today is Natalie Turner. We are both members of the KeyNote Women Speakers Directory, and in this podcast episode, we are in the season of Leadership Reimagined, bringing conversations that make a difference to the community. I'm super excited to have this conversation with Natalie because we've both just published our books very recently. Mine was in November 2025, and Natalie's was actually launched on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February, and recently she's done physical launch in Lisbon. That must be so exciting, Natalie. So good to be talking to you today. How was your book launch in Lisbon?
It was amazing. Thank you, Cindy. And I'm very excited to be here with you as well. It was awesome. There were 60 people in the room. It felt a little bit between getting married and a significant birthday, 22 different nationalities. Very, very exciting to physically launch it and hold it in my hand after all these years of writing.
I can imagine. So really excited to hear you talk about this.
Yeah, you too. Well, let me formally intro you, if I may. It would be lovely to hear all about you. You're an amazing woman, aren't you? You are an EQ maven, titanium hipster, certified speaking professional. You wear many, many hats with over 2 decades across multinationals, luxury brands, financial institutions. You bring rare credibility to every stage, but it's where you come from, I believe, that makes you unforgettable. Near bankruptcy, multiple addictions, and 2 titanium hip replacements. Today, you help leaders break through their BS and turn EQ into influence. Very excited, and I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you. And so did I. We will not review too much so that the listeners can get a nice journey of us opening up our books. I'd love to introduce you as well. So Natalie Turner, the person I'm having this lovely conversation with, is a strategic innovation and leadership advisor, keynote speaker, and novelist. Natalie, you are the creator of Red Silk Leadership, a body of work exploring identity, authority, and leadership at moments of transition. You're an award-winning nonfiction author and creator of the 6 Eyes Innovation Framework. Natalie, you have worked with C-suite leaders and global organizations on creativity, culture, and transformation. And you're also the author of The Red Silk Dress, a novel exploring agency, voice, and self-awakening through story. So I'm so excited to get started, Natalie. How has your voice evolved as a speaker and writer, and how has writing your book changed you? And now that you're in the second one, especially.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really interesting question because in many ways I've had a public voice long before writing this novel. For as long as I can remember, I have been a speaker of some description, almost a performer. And as a child, I was a street preacher in the church settings. I went to Bible college as I became a Bible teacher, later a professional speaker on innovation and leadership. It's always really been part of my identity, and having a message, a vocation, a sense of mission has been with me for a very long time. I wrote my first book, Yes, You Can Innovate, back in 2018, and that really houses my intellectual property around the 6 Eyes of innovation. It's a people and purpose-centered approach to creating and bringing new ideas into the world, helping organizations and individuals think quite differently about what they do and how they do things, particularly new things. And that's reinforced the identity that I've built around being a speaker, a writer, and a consultant. And when we think about identity, it hasn't been a false identity. It has been very, very real. But what writing a novel has done is it's really taken me into a very different territory. Really different. Instead of explaining ideas, I've had to inhabit this sort of inner world, the inner world of my character. Her name is Claudette. She's a French expat woman living in Malaysia. I began to explore the tension between how someone sort of appears, on the outside world and really what's going on inside of them. So she's very composed, she's very refined, very functional, but inside something different is happening to her. She's searching, she's disorientated, she's a bit lost, really. And she's trying to sort of reconcile parts of herself that she has put aside. I think, writing her has made me confront how common that gap can be, this distance between the identity people recognize and the interior life, we keep hidden from the outside world. I think, what's happening now for me after writing this, and it took me 11 years, so this is a long time, is that new messages are starting to emerge in my voice, around individual agency, courage, following that creative impulse. I had assumed that fiction would just be like a side thing. It would be like this side hobby. But in fact, it's broadening my professional voice in a deeper and more humane way. If I reflect back over those years, I can see what was pulling me forward at that time back in 2015 was I felt like something wasn't quite right in my own life and something was missing. And the novel, in a sense, the writing of it took me into a very different place, something more relational, in a more whole. It's interesting because when I read your book, Cindy, I thought, wow, yeah, it's like a parallel world, but coming from a very different perspective. I'd love to hear from you, when you realized you could no longer live with the story maybe that you were telling yourself, what was going on inside of you?
Mm, mm. Thank you for asking me this question. And when you mentioned Claudette and was reading your book, actually, I resonated so much with it. And I thought about, you sharing with me from being a street preacher to a speaker to now an author of two books. It's really, really quite amazing. And even reading The Red Silk Dress, it got me thinking, wow, Natalie is such a soulful writer, right? The book is sexy and is mystical. Mine was, I think, that moment of truth that really kind of sparked the change was at a hotel room in Bangkok, 26, so it's about 16 years ago. At that time, I was 6 months into a sales director role, a job I took purely for the title and salary. And at that time, I had just left the job I hated for this one. And I was just sitting on the bed, feeling completely lost and lazy. We were at a sales conference in Bangkok at that time. In that moment, I had a boyfriend. Maybe these days people call it partner, but I still call it boyfriend. This is a familiar word to me. And this person I was with for 18 months, I thought was going to propose to me. And he decided to leave me. So I remember looking up at the ceiling and tears were just kind of falling down my face, being a little bit dramatic, and I was saying, "Wow, Cindy, your life is nothing but a load of worthless crap." And in that moment, I remember thinking, I have lost all influence over myself, much less influence over anyone else. And I felt this deep sense. I don't know if I felt that before. It's just deep sense of like hatred. Like, how did I come to this point, right? At that time, I realized that the truth is I've been drowning in a lot of painful experiences. I've been asking myself the same questions like, why can't I get myself to do what I know I should be doing? Why am I losing so much control over my life? And why am I not respected? And at that time, thankfully, a mentor eventually pushed me into a program that confronted everything. And that's when I finally saw the pattern, which is the fact that I've spent years polishing the outside of my apple while the inside was decaying. So in
Wow.
2018, I decided I would write inside this book. I took 7 years. Not because I figured everything out, but just decided that I think it's time to stop pretending. The reason I had no influence over my external sphere and circumstances is because I simply had no influence over myself.
Wow.
Mm.
I think that's really interesting. When I was reading your book, what I really, really enjoyed was your stories, the stories that you brought to life, what was going on inside of you in a very vulnerable, very real, very honest way. And your book, it's called Breakthrough Your BS to Influence Yourself. Can you share a little bit more about what BS actually means, in your world?
Certainly. Some people would say like, "Oh, you're so rude, Cindy. You put the word BS on your cover." But I thought about and these were like conversations that I've had with friends as well, and they were always saying that I'm not really somebody who has got a ton of like wisdom to give, right? I don't go around saying I've got an insight for you. I have real life stories, and literally the BS that I had to go through to now even be where I am today. So I believe that self-influence starts with owning your BS. And I define BS as the invisible barriers that we can't see, we won't question, and we refuse to challenge that keep us stuck. So just to break it down a little bit more, the first BS is I call it the blind spots, which is things we can't see about ourselves, but everyone else can. For example, if I kind of relate this to us being authors and speakers, right? So the author, the BS could be, we might think that our writing is bold and original, but the readers are experiencing it as preachy and self-indulgent. And nobody tells them because nobody tells us. That's a cruel joke of blind spot. Hopefully, we can get someone to help us to shine a light on it through a mentor or a coach. Then the second BS is the belief systems, which I call the invisible scripts running our lives, the shoulds and musts we've inherited. Some of these serve us, but some of these cage us. For example, belief systems could be, I should have a PhD before I write a book. Or I must wait until I've mastered everything before I share what I know. Or I must write at least 2 hours a day. And actually, that was what left me editing chapter 1 for 5 years. It's horrible. So some of these belief systems were inherited through a teacher or somebody we've learned from the speakers industry, and we've been running on them without questioning ourselves, right? And the third BS is really the bull story. These are the lies, the excuses, the justifications that we tell ourselves to avoid discomfort. For example, I could lie and say I don't have time to write a book. Really? But you've watched 47 hours of Netflix last month. Well, I'm fine with not writing it. I'm now okay with not having a book being published. But you've been talking about it for the last 15 years. Your eyes still light up when somebody talks about your book. Like, you probably think about that, right? Oh, I'm just so happy for my friends when they succeed. Really? Then why does it eat you up so much when somebody else becomes a lot more successful than you? For me, it's really about radically calling out these BSs that trap you, because I believe your blind spots will endanger you, your belief systems will limit you, and your bull stories lie to you. So owning your BS is to radically call it out, clean it up, and correct it. And that's where the real self-influence begins. I'm like a truth teller as much as I can. So I really want to ask, what kind of truth becomes possible in writing that is harder to access on stage or in professional settings?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very interesting question, because I think that the difference between writing nonfiction and writing a novel is the seasons it takes you through. And like you, it's a long time coming in that way. When I wrote Yes, You Can Innovate, I was working at the level of language, of explanation, articulating ideas and frameworks that already existed in my professional life. So it was a very different type of experience. I was offering a map of tools around the 6 eyes of innovation, approaches to help people, generate ideas and bring them to life. It was very externally facing, but writing fiction has been a completely different story. It's been a lot slower, a far more interior experience. And if we break it down, into the types of drafting, I mean, you're talking about, drafting your chapters and things, but the first draft of writing a novel, that's the one that's very much like, what you see on the films. It's just this wild experience. It's, you're world building, you're creating characters, you're drawing emotion on fragments of experience that aren't even consciously organized. They're just appearing in your imagination. And I remember being surprised by what came out of me sometimes. And I was like, wow, did I really just write that? It's just like, oh, okay. And actually sometimes it could become quite unsettling, because it wasn't coming through the grid of my reason and of my intellect. It was coming from somewhere deeper. And I can remember a writing coach at the time. She said to me, if you're not feeling the emotion of your character, you're not going deep enough. You've got to become her. You've got to feel into her, feel her pain, feel the joy, the desire, the anger, the isolation. And in doing that really does take you into a very different place, where you start to even tell yourself or start to expose certain truths in your own life. Because the novel took me into Claudette's interior, her self-doubt, her fear, her longing, and that was very, very uncomfortable. And then, obviously you've got rewriting that starts. You've got this sort of basic story that's emerged, but then you've got the rewriting and redrafting, which is where the real work of writing a novel lives. And you've got to deepen the character, their emotional lives. You've got to go deeper into those states to be able to write well from that position. But what happened for me, I think, was this slowing down. It created a type of peace and presence I didn't have really in my life before. It was, and I didn't notice this until really quite recently. I realized that there was less striving or less desire to strive, less performance orientation, more attunement to life, to people, a broader spectrum of both softness and strength. So fiction for me made possible not just understanding, but inhabiting truth. And I think it lets us approach truth in a different way, sideways, if you like, where we might not be quite ready to name it directly.
Well, I love hearing you just describing that, right? Because it brings me back to the chapter where she met somebody and then she was really attracted to this guy. And I was like, whoa, did Natalie just write that? But not only do you feel it, I feel it as well because those are my secret thoughts too.
That's so funny.
It's so lovely to hear, your passion and your energy, the inspiration just coming up when you're talking about you writing this novel. It sounds like it's something that really, really connected to your heart.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
it's very often, we have to kind of get deep into things, sense our emotions, be very attuned to ourselves before we can kind of tune out what's outside at the world, right? It's not, it becomes performative, becomes framework. The question I want to ask you is when does adapting to the world stop helping us and start costing us?
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because if we're thinking about leadership reimagined, the leadership context, I think adaptation strengthens leadership when it's conscious, when it's really coming as a form of discernment. We read the room, we understand context, we respond to intelligence. But it begins to cost us when this sort of adaptation becomes so habitual, like you say, performative. We no longer feel, where is the performance beginning and where is it ending? We become so polished because we've rehearsed so much to be who we are and to be able to stand on a stage or to write a book or to have, clarity about our message. We've spent hours and hours and hours performing, haven't we? I think that there feels like there's two levels for me. One is for the novel and one is personally. In the novel, in the red silk dress, it's that tension in a sense which sits at the heart of the story. Claudette appears externally very composed, very elegant, highly functional, in the world, coping. She's forced to confront not just what she wants, but who she has become in the process of holding everything together. And how that sort of shifted and changed her over the years. And that's what confronts her. That is her story, her storyline. And for me personally, as I was writing that, something in the writing process softened inside me because my professional identity has long been built around strength, competence, authority, what I now call these sort of stone qualities. But writing a novel opened up another side to me, what I now call silk. So that's softness, more relational intelligence, more beauty, more presence to life and presence to people. And I realized that I had over identified with one side of myself. The leadership image was very strong, but it was incomplete. So the deeper question became, when does adaptation stop being a strategy and when does it become self-abandonment? And that really has taken me now on my own journey. And I think, when I read your book, I was looking at how you frame things and how you bring yourself, and you were really vulnerable around these issues around performance and identity and who you were on the outside and what was going on in the inside. So I'd love to ask you actually, when did fitting in start to cost you more than standing out?
That's such a good question because I think that my entire life is about, Cindy, are you ever going to fit in? So that was always a question in
Oh.
my mind, even as a child. In fact, when I was a kid, I was never really worried about fitting in until my very first job. Yeah, I was 19 years old. I joined the airline at that time. I came from a family that I wouldn't say that we are dirt poor, but we were in lack. Yeah. So we didn't have extra money. It was just food on the table, school fees, and that's it. We had hand me downs and we don't really buy new things. So when I joined the airline, it was like my dream job because I had really mediocre grades at school. So I didn't really think I could do anything else. I thought this was everything I wanted and the only thing I wanted. In my mind at that time, I was going to earn good money on my own. I'm going to travel all over the world to places like London and Paris and just like make good money, right? They actually put us through 4 months of training. And after 4 months of training, they invested money on us. My very first flight was Singapore to Osaka. At that time, I was so excited. I was so ready. And I thought, well, people are going to love me. I'm on the flight with the senior crew. And interestingly, nobody seemed to even like me. Okay, not even love, but nobody even liked me. You would hear them say things like, why is your voice so low? Didn't they teach you that in training? Comments were like really catty, bitchy remarks. We had a name for that culture, which we called zapping. I remember halfway through that Osaka flight, my team leader at that time called me to the back of the aircraft for a debrief. She gave me a really stern look and she says, Cindy, you need to manage your facial expressions. You're not smiling enough. Put on your public face. Nobody likes you if you're not smiling. So, I mean, at the time, I kind of know that I need to smile, but I didn't know I had to smile, really smile. And so I was like, okay. And then she went like, you need to smile with energy, Cindy. So I went like, okay. And I think in that moment, I just sort of like realized I have to put up a front. Like nobody wants an authentic you here. And all the while in my head, I'm thinking, I now have to put up with these mean people and now I have to smile like a moron, right? So I think everything started to become like all messed up inside. But I kind of accepted it at that age. I didn't think it was a choice. I needed that job. So from that day onwards, the moment I put on my uniform, I would just smile. So I would smile at the gates, at the ticket counters, at the aircraft, and I smiled so much that my dog didn't even recognize me when I went home. But the interesting thing was that I was rewarded for that. I was rewarded for being the different version of myself. So the senior crew started to like me. I got better work positions. Suddenly I have friends and my flying career was starting to peak. So I started believing that you know what? If I put on a different version of me, if I were to please people, I'll succeed.
Right.
So on the outside, I was like, okay, I'm a sunflower, but on the inside, honestly, there's this feeling of I'm so sick of myself. Why am
Mm,
I performing all the time? And all I wanted to do was to just honestly throw the uniform aside,
yeah.
not smile, but light up a cigarette and crack open a can of beer just to feel human again. And that's exactly what I did after every flight. Yeah, so at
Wow.
that time, I think that was really like the beginning of me losing myself. And only in hindsight that I realized that.
Yeah, yeah, when you're saying about that uniform as well, it literally is, isn't it? It's like the embodiment of taking on the external, literally, and also then how you have to show up and how that is then reinforced back from the reward that you were receiving, but inside just breaking apart in that sense. So, with your book, what did writing it force you to say out loud that you'd never admitted even to yourself?
Mm. This is such a great question. Had all of these stories happened at a much younger point of my life, and I never even thought I would share any of these until I started training myself to be a speaker. And my mentor was saying, "You have to share stories, right?" Yeah, what stories do I have? I realized I had a lot of stories. I never spoke about them till my early 40s when I started training myself to be a speaker. I think writing Insight forced me to put my whole story on paper for the world to read. And the hardest part was just really admitting how much time, effort, and energy I spent looking polished on the outside while I was completely falling apart on the inside. Yeah, so I mean, using the example of cabin crew buns, we spend a lot of time clipping and spraying every morning before the flight.
Right.
So, those sleek, neatly piled up buns. And there is a unwritten rule in the airline. It's unwritten. Nobody really says it, but it's kind of unwritten in the sense that the higher your bun is, the more power you have, the more
Right.
senior you have. So those of us who enjoy power would poof our hair, Elvis Presley. I was one of those people who was really, really polished, and I would go smiling at people. We had a lot of friends, right? One question I always ask is, most of the time, people, if I would ask, are you genuinely happy when you see people around you succeed? And people, most of the time, would say yes. And I was never that person. I was always the very jealous, very envious person when I was younger. So if I see anyone else that's better than me, it just made me like mean and suicidal and homicidal, right? So that's how dark it got in my head. Yeah. And the fact that there were so many others in the airline who spoke better, looked better, and were treated better than me was really unacceptable. So it
Wow.
drove me into like this constant need to hustle and grind, to network with the seniors, put up a front. I need to look better. I need to stand out. I need to fit in my uniform. I'll go on diets. And I feel like there was a lot of competition going on, but honestly, if I on hindsight, I think the biggest competition was just inside my head. I had all of this stress, my own stress, I'm guessing it was self-induced. And after that, the drinking became a coping mechanism. One beer became three, and then three beers became a bottle of wine, and then bottle of wine became a bottle of whiskey. And then soon enough, I was chasing sleeping pills with Johnny Walker every night, smoking like
Wow.
a chimney, very glamorous as you can imagine. My personal record at that time was half a bottle of Johnny Walker and 8 sleeping pills in one night.
God.
Blacked out for 24 hours in Copenhagen. The next morning, I got up, showered, did my makeup, and smiled. And the BS I told myself then was, well, you're fine, Cindy. You still show up looking like a professional. Until 6 years later, I was sitting in front of an orthopedic specialist because I've been feeling pain in my legs for weeks. And after a few scans, the doctor then told me, Cindy, there are 4 stages to this disease that you have been diagnosed with called avascular necrosis. You're
Um,
on stage 4 right now, and you have the hip joints of a 90-year-old woman. What he told me then was, you need to get a contractor to renovate your home because there's a high chance you'll be living your life in a wheelchair. And that time I was like about 24, 25 years old. Yeah. My mom was asking the doctor, so how did this happen to my girl, right? We don't have family history of this. So what could have caused her to get this diagnosis of degeneration of hip joint? She's so young. The doctor started asking me questions about my lifestyle, what I do on a regular basis, what I work as. After some investigation, he came to the conclusion that it was because of alcoholism,
all right.
substance abuse, and severe eating disorders. Yeah, so this is what happens when our BSs run the show.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
and that was, really, it didn't just break me on the inside, it broke me on the outside as well. So that's the truth
Wow.
I
Thank
had
you for
to
sharing.
really, really say.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. When I read your book, I could feel the pain and through the vulnerability of how you shared that in story as well. And I think as a speaker, you can tell these stories, but having it now in book form and having it for a wider audience that people can access it and see that and learn from your experiences as well as go deeper into their own, I think is very, very powerful. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. And I think for me, the gift that I hope to bring through this book is for me to be able to tell my truth so that I can live in truth. And
Mm.
as a result, I can hopefully inspire others to also live their truth, right? So that's the question I really want to ask you. What does truth, in your perspective, ask of us once we see it clearly?
Mm. Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? It's like once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, can you? I think once your eyes start to open, and it's like gentle shifts often that can nudge you along, or more dramatic in your case, that move you along, and then suddenly there's a realization. that something is amiss or something needs to be dealt with, sorted in a particular way. And I feel that, with truth, sort of that inner clarity, it's absolutely essential, but it's not enough. It's like we can come into a realization about who we are or who we're actually becoming. But if we put it back into a leadership frame as well, good leadership asks for more than recognition. It asks us to be courageous.
Mm,
And at some point, that clarity, that inner knowing, has to move, it has to shift, it has to become action. It has to take form in the world. I think about my writing process and the story of Claudette, her journey. I don't want to give the story away, but there is a moment, or there's multiple moments, as Claudette becomes aware of her truth. And then the question becomes, what is she prepared to do about that?
mm,
What is she willing to change in her own life? What is she willing to stop saying to herself, telling herself? I think that, writing in itself is like an act of courage. And, as I'm listening to you, the courage it's taken for you to write about your own life, you're taking something internal, whether it's a story, a narrative like what I've done with Claudette, or something that's nonfiction but is your own personal story, and you're giving it form. You're putting it out in the world. It's a very vulnerable thing to do. When you were saying earlier about when you were reading chapter 3 of my book, you're thinking, wow, did Natalie write this? I often thought, God, I wonder what people are actually going to think of me when they read this, because they know me as a particular type of person as a speaker. And this is very, very different, isn't it? There is an act of being vulnerable
mm,
within that process. I'm noticing now that the novel hasn't just been something I've written. It's opening up in me a completely new chapter of my life. And I'm starting to call it my red silk era. It's because it's becoming bigger than the book itself. It's actually affecting how I live, the spaces I'm creating, conversations I'm having, collaborations, even my work with women, women who lead. And out of this, I'm creating something called Red Silk Leadership. It's a deeper inquiry into how we live and how we lead when this strength of authority and the power of who we can be and the softness of who we are integrated. It's been funny, so many people have been coming up to me, and some people know me well, some people not so well, and they say, "Wow, something in you feels a little bit different, Natalie. What's going on?" There's a little bit more warmth there, a bit more presence, and attunement, if you like. I think that once truth becomes clear in our life,
mm,
it starts asking us questions. It asks us something of our life. And that's where change begins. It's in our response to that truth. And we can either walk away from it or just say, well, that was interesting, and I'll just carry on with who I am. Or we start to listen to his voice and say, okay, what does this now call of me? So that's really how I'm seeing it.
So it's so powerful and profound at the same time, right? And
Mhm.
to just hear about how we can be both strength and so, and talking about, people saying, oh, Natalie has become a different person. I can actually sense a difference in you as well. I remember seeing you in Singapore in some of the keynote speakers events and some of the speaker events. So it's just something has evolved and changed about you, which is really lovely. It feels like you've stepped into this softer, more present era, which is very attractive. I think as women, we can absolutely embody both strength and silk. And I love, love, love the fact that you have used the name Red Silk Leadership as a program, because I think we no longer need to perpetuate, hey, presence, presence, executive presence, and just strength, right? I think women can be so many things. My next question to you is, what is this next season of your work and your
Mm.
voice asking of you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen my truth, and now I've got to respond to that. And it's like it's exploding in me. The amount of ideas and creativity and new things that are evolving. It's been absolutely delightful. It's been extraordinary this season that I'm in right now. And for a period of time, my work has sat clearly in the domain of innovation and leadership. And of course, that continues. But even that, within a corporate sense, is deepening because, innovation is not just about organizations and the development of new products or services. It's how we innovate our lives, it's how we navigate our identity, our purpose, our own individual transformation, both as individuals and collectively. So, alongside that, this red silk leadership is now emerging as a deeper inquiry into how we live and lead, combining these qualities of silk and stone. Then, around that, around the novel itself, I'm developing red silk suppers, red silk salons, artistic collaborations, different types of conversation and, different types of containers to express some of these ideas. And I'm noticing that these threads are not separate. They're very different expressions, but of the same inquiry that's central to it. How do we as humans evolve, and how does our leadership become more truthful as we grow? This next season for me, for my voice, is less about choosing one path and more about letting these different threads integrate and weave a more coherent story. From a keynote perspective, what's also really exciting is, I'm starting to shape new keynotes that bring together these different elements of storytelling in the essence of a novel, of being a novelist now, and leadership in a more human way. A lot of women in the first parts of their life, we're learning to be in the world and to be strong in the world. And this next season, it's something deeper. How do we remain truthful to ourselves as we lead? How do we find courage to transform our own lives, even if we are going to step into the unknown? Because we only ever need courage if we're going to step into the unknown. Otherwise, we don't need it. Why do you need courage? You only need to have that if you're going to actually step out and do something different. So for me, it's not just about some sort of new project or a side hustle or, how I've fulfilled this lifelong dream of becoming a novelist. It's like landed in my life and it's sort of transforming me and bringing a very, very different expression and an integrated expression in different aspects of my life. So it's going to be an exciting time. Well, it already is an exciting time, but I feel it very, very much.
Well, I love
Um,
this, Natalie. It seems like all this integration has really moved you, changed you, is given you new pathways to new opportunities, new conversations, new keynotes. I can so imagine you bringing a red silk dress on the stage with you and just talking about Claudette. I think that would be so beautiful. I love this idea of us deepening the truth, living in truth, living in courage. So it's really, really
mm.
powerful, Natalie.
Thank you, Cindy. And that brings us to a final
Yeah.
question for you. I'd love to hear your closing reflection. Given everything we've explored, and it's been really rich conversation, what final message, would you like to leave with anyone who's listening in to this conversation?
I'm one person who, okay, maybe that's my own BS talking, but I always like, I don't have wisdom to give to people, so just tell the story, okay? So it's that. But I think me writing this book is, I don't know if I'll ever write a book again. So I figured that, I will write one, and one day if I'm no longer around on this earth, at least my family members have got something to remember me by. When I first started writing it, there was a lot of self-doubt, right? Like, who are you? Who would want to read your story? So those classic self-doubts, but after I read it, it's like exactly like what you said, Natalie. You read it, and then I felt so much. Even I was reading, there were many times where I would write, I would cry, I would read, and I realized that, hey, I think this has got some level of power, and I don't know if it will help anybody, but I think it will connect with certain people. I kind of
Yeah.
started this conversation by saying that I had lost all influence myself in that Bangkok hotel room. And for me, the turning point wasn't really like a framework or some big enlightenment. It really was a decision to stop looking outside, looking away, and start looking inward. So if I could leave our listeners with one thing, it's this, imagine that you are 85 years old right now. Mm. Looking back on your life, who is the person you would have wanted to be? There's so much to think about that. And just as important, who is the person you would not have wanted to become? Getting crystal
Lovely.
clear on both ends. Yeah, because we're so busy, right? We are so busy keeping up with everyone and everything on the outside. We are earning, we are branding, we are working. But let's also not forget about what's happening on the inside.
Yeah,
Because the
perfect.
first and most important person you'll ever influence is truly yourself. And if you can speak in truth, you will be able to live your truth.
Lovely, Cindy. What a great message to end this fantastic, beautiful conversation that we've had today. Keynote Women Expert Voices. Anybody interested in keynotes, then you can find out more at keynotewomen.com. And this is part of a series around leadership reimagined. I think we've been doing that today, haven't we, Cindy? We've
Yes,
certainly
we
been
have.
exploring a very different perspective of our own lives and of what leadership can mean. So thank you very much for being part of this conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you, Natalie. And I hope we will continue this conversation again if you're ever
Mm,
gonna step into Singapore, or if I'm gonna invite
absolutely.
you are. This has been really enjoyable.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.